Thank you, everyone. This is definitely an honor to present in front of such a group. All right, so without further ado, my name is Tim. I'm here to present on automotive safety validation and simulation. And let's kick it off with taking a look at different forms of transportation and what these transportation forms have in terms of difficulties leading to validation. And so we have aircraft, cars, and trains. And at a first glance, we have the main difference is their numbers of spatial dimensions. So aircraft move in 3 dimensions, cars principally in 2, and trains principally in 1. And so from that, we can initially gather that perhaps aircraft are more difficult because you have more decisions to make. But at the same time, you have more choices available to you so that you can be safer. Whereas a train can just go forward and back. If there is something there, they have to deal with it. Next, we look at pilots. These first two are these outlying transportation methods are piloted by professionals. Whereas, as we can all testify, automobiles have many amateurs. This leads to difficulties in safety certification. Vehicle quantities are another matter. There are far more cars than there are aircraft or trains. And the cost of electronics that go into cars is, on average, much lower than the cost of electronics that go into things like aircraft. And so these cars have to function with potentially worse equipment. Accident investigations are also a big deal, especially in aviation, where every time something bad happens, there's an extensive investigation. And with cars, there are often collisions, and oftentimes investigations aren't quite as extensive. And building on that, the ownership of the information that comes out of these investigations isn't made public or shared with everyone in the same way that it is with the aviation industry. So we can look at some metrics. So for instance, passenger fatalities per billion miles. And some modes of transportation, like aircraft, are much safer than driving. So at 1 billion miles, a human is expected to, well, they're expected to be 7.28 fatalities, whereas with aircraft, that's 2 orders of magnitude lower. But the most important thing, the biggest difference, is the number of entity interactions. With aircraft, if you look up in the sky, you will see at most 6 objects. With trains, you have the thing in front of you and the thing behind you, potentially. But with cars, you have far more going on, and you have to worry about all of these entities around you that at any point could potentially do something that you did not expect. So let's look at a specific safety system. This is the Mercedes-Benz E-Class that came out in 2009, and it had on it an emergency braking assist system. So here you're zooming along on the freeway or on the German Autobahn, and you have sensors on board that can detect if there is a vehicle down the road in front of you. Perhaps you're going too fast and this vehicle is going slower than you, and there could be an issue. So there are 2 phases for this. In the first phase, it's going to magnify your braking effect. So if I start hitting the brake because of this vehicle in front of me, it will magnify that effect. And this occurred about every 50,000 kilometers based on real-world testing that Mercedes-Benz did. However, there's also a second phase, and this is the critical phase where now it's too late, we're going to probably collide, and it's going to apply 100% braking force. That's just what's going to happen. And over 36 million kilometers reported by Mercedes-Benz, this never occurred. And so with real-world testing, employees driving on the freeways, this second phase was not triggered. This is a fairly simple system. We can imagine that with an autonomous car, where so much more is going on, we need to figure out if we can actually cover these events. Or if we don't cover them, still become confident that these systems are going to be safe, or at least as safe as we need them to be. And to put this into perspective, if you hire one person to drive 8 hours a day on the freeway, it'll take about 110 years. So, and that's just for this simple system. All right, more motivations of the orders of magnitude of how difficult this is. So Fach et al., they claim that current driver's assistance systems, like the Mercedes-Benz systems, require about 2 million test kilometers, which we already saw 36 million didn't cover all situations. Collier et al. Have a paper that is a little contentious, but they claim 14.2 billion kilometers to estimate the fatality rate for a system within 20% with 95% confidence if the system is as safe as humans. Winner et al. Claim 2.1 billion kilometers if the system is twice as safe as humans. So here, potentially it's easier if the system is twice as safe. It gets really difficult when the human is just as safe as the system. But we're looking at very, very, very large distances. And I'm not claiming any of these numbers are the number, but I am claiming that people are worried about the amount of testing that needs to be done. In addition, I have another fun citation. Dr. Jan Becker gave a presentation in which he stated that validation expenditure will increase by a factor of 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 7th. So not only do we have to do this large amount of testing, we're also worried about how much it will cost. All right. So we want to go away from real-world driving, which is cost prohibitive, time-consuming, and presumably risky because there will be fatalities on the road, or could be fatalities on the road. And we want to move to simulation. Simulation being cheap, fast, and no risk because we're doing it all in the computer. However, it requires models. And this is the big however. Here we have the perfect environment. Here we have to recreate the perfect environment. And that's where things get difficult. And so, before I dig into exactly what my contributions are, I'm going to define some terms. What do we mean by validating the safety of this system? So we're going to look at risk. And so this is what ISO 26262 uses. And risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So we're looking at two things here. One is harm, so physical injury or damage to other people, things like fatalities, collisions. We want to minimize these. But at the same time, we also, and things have, there are different levels of these, so there's severity, so there's no injury, light, moderate injury, etc. But at the same time, we want to also minimize the probability of each class. And so if we only reduce fatalities, we may increase the number of injuries, and we want to be able to figure out how we're trading those things up. All right. Next, we have the scene. This is a set of vehicles on the road. It is their physical state, a snapshot in time at t equals 0 or t equals t. We're going to modify that and get a situation. The situation is the same, except now each vehicle has a behavior state. This can include things about what they believe about what is occurring around them. It can be their aggressiveness or timidness, and it can also include things like intention. I intend to take that next exit. And adding this will then allow us to put it in a simulator and get different results every time you simulate, because we know people have these different distributions over what they intend to do and how they act. And then by running a simulation, by doing a rollout, we get a scenario. So this is what happens if you play it out as a movie. And again, because we're using distributions, if you roll out multiple times, you'll get different variations. All right. So we can do this. So we can take a distribution over these situations, which are cars plus behaviors. We can sample them to get a particular situation at time equals 0, and then run a simulation. We propagate that forward. And at the end, we end up with our rollout, so that scenario play out. We do this many times. This is just like putting a driver out on the real world. We drive our billions of miles, and we extract performance metrics from this. Things like fatalities, collisions, maybe things that we care about that aren't those. So did we get to where we wanted to on time? Did we increase congestion, et cetera? This is the fundamental idea of validation through simulation. Now we're going to discuss the models we need to achieve this simulation. The fundamental core of the simulator is the simulation loop. You have all of your entities on the road, and one at a time you need to do all of these steps. So first, each entity observes its environment. Things like perception, LiDAR, radar. Updates its internal state. Then, that's a sensor model. Then the entity selects its action. Based on its internal state, it decides what it's going to do. Make a lane change, accelerate, brake. These are behavior models. And lastly, each entity needs to act. To take their action, if it's an acceleration, we use typically physics models to propagate that forward, or vehicle dynamics models. So we have sensor models, behavior models, and dynamics models. But this is not all. We still need to get our distribution over our initial conditions. This is particularly tricky as well. So you might have something like an environment distribution from which you get your roadway. And then your roadway may inform another distribution over scenes, which gives you the physical states of the vehicles on that roadway, which in turn informs other distributions like a behavior distribution that gives you the behaviors for each vehicle. And finally, you can also have a distribution over things like sensors to get the sensors that are equipped to your vehicles should they be automated. And all these together go into sampling your situation. And so we have a lot of models that we need, and we need them to be good enough that they adequately capture what happens on the roadway for the purposes of safety validation. What have I done? All right, so my thesis contributions are first in behavior models. So I came up with ways to measure the performance of these models. Came up with Bayesian network behavioral cloning approaches, which were good for short-term predictions. And most recently with colleagues who are here, did generative adversarial imitation learning, which was much better at doing long-term, stable human behavior analysis. I also developed a sensor model. So I first generalized an input architecture for deep stochastic models for automotive purposes. And then I applied this to radar. Radar being perhaps, well, definitely one of the hardest sensors to model because you have to propagate 3D waves through a complicated environment. And we used data and deep learning to come up with these models that produce much better results than what could be obtained otherwise in real time. Came up with a great approach, in my opinion, for scene distributions, both an incremental roadway population model based on Bayesian networks, and what we'll dig into in depth, a factor graph scene model, which also applies to situations. And lastly, I tied these contributions together to wrap it up and performed validation. And to avoid running billions of simulations, billions of miles of simulations, we looked at ways to accelerate that validation. And we'll go into this in depth as well. So overall, we have all those different categories, and I've touched several of them in this dissertation. And I will focus on my scene distribution and accelerated validation in this talk. So if you do have questions on the other topics, feel free to ask them at the end, but this is what I will focus on here. So without further ado, I'm going to discuss scene distributions. So here we have a driving scene. We have a roadway, we have vehicles on that roadway, talking about physical states. We could produce a probability distribution over this by saying, okay, each car has 4 variables, so maybe 2 position variables, a speed and a heading, and we can clump those together and get a probability distribution over these 16 variables. Take data, learn it, done. However, if we get rid of a car, suddenly our distribution either needs to be marginalized or we have to learn a different one. If we had a car, suddenly we can't use our distribution and we have to maybe learn a new one. If we change the roadway, maybe things are different now too. And we should have maybe thought of that before, or maybe now just learn another one. And pretty quickly, you can see that this goes kind of off the rails. And we're not talking about 4-car scenes. We're talking about scenes with many cars. And not just straight roadways. We want roundabouts, on-ramps, off-ramps, etc. So this gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So what we need is this distribution over driving scenes that works with a variable number of vehicles. So not just 4, but n. We want it to capture arbitrary roadway geometries, on-ramps, off-ramps, roundabouts. We want to be able to sample from these fairly efficiently. We want relative likelihood. So if I have 2 versions of a scene, which one is more likely and by how much? Because again, likelihood goes into overall risk. It's not just severity. And lastly, we want to learn all of this automatically. We don't want to hand pick features and do all of this stuff by hand. All right, so how has this been done in the past? First, we have just sampling from recorded data. And this is not that great of an approach. So say I'm Google, and I have 1 million miles recorded on hard disks. What I can do is I can just sample from things I've seen in the past. And maybe if I'm Google, I have good coverage of Palo Alto and Arizona, but it's impossible for me to take this and extend it to places that I have not driven. So that's a limitation. The second approach, which is used by many commercial simulators, is to start off with an empty roadway and then spawn vehicles. I'm going to spawn vehicles, and I'm going to simulate them over time. And over time, then the vehicle network gets populated, and I'll stop it, and I'll say, OK, this is now my time equals 0. And that will potentially work, but it has a lot of baggage. And so you need to know what vehicles to spawn. You need to know where to spawn them, which is a very specific thing to your roadway. And you need the whole simulation loop to exist, and it has to be valid. And then there are some questions of, if I simulated it with one behavior and now for t equals 0, I suddenly initialize it with a different behavior, does that mess me up? So this also leaves some things to be decided. So the first contribution that I made in this field was generation via local correlations. And so here we just have a distribution over the scene. We don't need the simulation loop. It starts with an empty roadway. And then I've learned a distribution from data over vehicles given their neighbors. And I can sample from the marginal distribution to get my first vehicles. And then given those vehicles, I can condition on them in order to get kind of the next vehicle in the scene. And I repeatedly do this to construct the scene outwards. You can go back to front, forward to back, not critical. And in the end, you end up with your generated scene. This still has some limitations. First off, it's tricky to know how to set up this distribution. You have to do a lot of conditioning. So sometimes this isn't perfect, but I did show promising results with that. Hard to extend to arbitrary roadways and correlations between cars. You still need to know what types of cars to spawn, which increases the dimensionality. And incorporating road use is difficult. And what I mean by this is kind of the macro effect. If I have a particular intersection that has an on-ramp that's full of cars, if I use this approach, there's no way for the model to know that I need to populate that on-ramp more than other parts of the roadway without either A, learning a specific distribution for that intersection, or as a benevolent dictator telling it to do that. And so we want to avoid things like that. So we get to my second distribution approach, the factor graph scene models, which solves some of these problems. So we're going to use factor graphs. I'll go into exactly what those are. Roadways are populated as they are in the real world. It works over varying numbers of cars. You get these vehicle relations and vehicle type correlations. Works with arbitrary roadways. We get a bonus. The learning objective is concave. So not only does that mean that it's faster potentially to train, but also everyone will agree on an optimum. And we get efficiency via parameter chaining. So here we have our same roadway. I'm now going to build a factor graph on this. So I'm going to start by saying, OK, I have those 4 variables. I want to capture different aspects of this scene. I'm going to start by assigning a factor to each vehicle. This is, you could think of it as a little probability distribution. And this factor is going to capture things about the vehicle's self. So it only cares about one vehicle. So we have this factor, and it might care about that vehicle's speed, where it is in the lane, heading, etc. And it only cares about that vehicle. So far, we don't have any correlations between cars. So we add additional factors, in this case, a lead-follow pair, that now binds these 2 cars together in a probabilistic sense. So if this car starts going faster, it increases the likelihood that this car is going fast. They're really close together. You can capture correlations there as well. And then lastly, I add correlations across lanes. You can imagine if 2 cars are going to make lane changes, you don't want them running into each other because that's unlikely. Or maybe it happens sometimes and we want to learn it. And so we have this procedural way of generating these correlations between cars, capturing this probability distribution. One thing I'd like to point out, we only learn one set of parameters for each of these factors. So there's one set of parameters for the blue, one set for the green, one set for the red, and we reuse them. So we're sharing these factors that we've learned separately. And we can then construct a scene using them. A factor graph is a bipartite graph. What that means is we have our 16 variables here, and we then connect them to different instances of these factors. And we can, if we increase the number of variables, and we can also increase the number of factors, and we'll see that later on. The same approach works if we take away a car. Now we can still build our factor graph. It's robust to this. We can also add a car. And if we follow the same rules for how we construct our factor graphs, we still end up with our distribution that captures these relationships between vehicles. It will work for larger scenes as well. And so here we have an ngsim scene, about 100 meters long, and we can build our factor graph on this larger scene. We can sample from it, and we end up with a new scene, cars in different positions, different velocities, but still realistic. In this picture, maybe you can claim, okay, they're not running into each other, but did this actually work? How can we measure and gain confidence that this distribution is actually what we want? And what we did is we took this model, trained on end use and data, we sample a bunch of scenes, and then we extract some different metrics from it, or different variables. We get distributions over those variables, and we then compare how those distributions match to withheld real-world data and to the other incremental roadway approach. And I'll show you that after we go through factor graph definitions. All right, so a factor is, at its core, maps a subset of random variables, x1 through n. So x1 through n are the variables in my probability distribution. And I'm going to map those to a non-negative real value, so just something 0 or greater. And think of it as an unnormalized probability distribution. A factor graph is a collection of these. So we have a bunch of these factors that have different inputs. We multiply them together, and we end up with a number 0 or greater. In order to get a probability, we need to divide by a constant z that makes sure that this result integrates to 1. Alert. Z requires integrating over every single variable in your distribution, actually the whole field. And so computing Z is very difficult. So unfortunately, if we have maybe 25 cars times 4 variables per car, that's 100 variables we have to simultaneously integrate over. So calculating Z is very annoying. Let's keep that in mind. We want to sample from this distribution, though. And we may have that unnormalized probability distribution, but we still have that Z that we need to calculate. It turns out the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm will let us sample from a factor graph, and it avoids needing Z. So we never need to calculate it, which is fantastic. How does this work? We start with an initial scene. Now what I'm going to do is I have a probability distribution T, which is my proposal distribution for transitions. I'm going to sample from that, and it's going to propose a change. So maybe proposes this change of moving this car from there to there. Now, the algorithm will either accept or reject that change based on the relative likelihood of that change. So we have the probability of the new scene over the probability of the old scene. Now, if you imagine each of those has a 1 over z in front of it, those 1 over z's cancel, so we don't need them. And we also include the probability of the transition distributions, which is typically ignored because you make it symmetric. All right, so maybe this is fairly likely. The car's still on the road. It's still driving in a good direction. Maybe it's driving a little slower, but we'll accept it. Now we have this scene. We keep going. We propose a new change. Now we're here. Maybe this is unlikely because now this car is going off the road, and so it doesn't get accepted. We keep running this for a while. So maybe 1,000 samples where we consider a change, accept or reject, and then move on. And at the end, we've searched this probabilistic space over these scenes, and because it's using this Markov chain, in the end we explore it and we stop it, and it's as if we have sampled from that initial distribution. We have the scene sampled from that. Excellent. The form that these factors take is log linear. Log linear turns out to be very convenient. So each of those circles is a sum over a set of features, where each feature is weighted by a weight theta. And those thetas are what we will learn. The f's can be arbitrary, so they can be nonlinear, doesn't matter. It's the thetas that we are going to learn, and that learning objective, as I said earlier, is concave. The actual features that I used are these. You can change them. So we have lane relation, which is a polynomial over things like speed, lane offset, heading, and combinations thereof. We have a following factor, which is a polynomial over relative speed and headway distance. If you have more data, you can increase the number of features. And then my neighbor features were indicator bins based on time to and distance at closest approach. This was to prevent cars that were likely for plugging each other from ending up in those configurations. And so we need to learn those weights. You typically would learn those weights by maximizing likelihood. Say I have my data and I want to maximize the likelihood that I get the data that I have. The way that looks is like this. If I have a particular scene with n variables, I have to take the product over each variable given the variables before it. This is likelihood. Unfortunately, this requires integrating out all of the variables that came after. And so for the probability of x1, I need to integrate out x2, 3, and 4. If you have, again, 100 variables, this gets extremely, extremely expensive. So we learn by maximizing the pseudo-likelihood, which is very similar, but is much easier to compute. So here, we take the product, but it's each variable given the other variables. And so now when we expand it, because all of those variables are given, we don't have to marginalize anything out. And it's much more efficient to learn. I did not come up with this. This is used in general for Markov nets or factor graphs. But we're definitely going to leverage it and see it as an advantage. All right, so here are the results. So we're taking this black line, which is metrics extracted from real-world data. We have the red lines, which is this old Bayesian network incremental roadway population model. And then we have the factor graph, which is the blue line, which we can see much more closely fits the observed data. In order to measure that fit, we use the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which measures the error in the distribution match. So small bars are better. So we have blue bars are small, which means a closer fit to the observed data. That's for the small scenes. That was for the 100-meter scenes, which are still small. We can do better. We can have larger scenes. And now I'm going to show you an experiment that looks at that macro property I mentioned, where if you use the factor graph scenes, you still get that macro. Certain areas will be populated differently than other areas. So in theory, we have the NGSIM roadway for 101. We have, I think this is 5 lanes of fairly congested flow. And then we have this one lane, this auxiliary lane, that's what they call it, which doesn't have that many vehicles on it, and they're traveling much faster because they're getting on and off the freeway. They're happy to escape or they're excited to get on. So you can look at it more closely. Here we have a lot of cars in this auxiliary lane, but here only has 2. So these vehicles exhibit different properties than the vehicles in the mainline flow. So on the left, we have the mainline flow. On the right, we have the auxiliary lane. The speed here is lower. So the speed here is like 10, and the speed here is like 15. And the factor graph, because it's seeded with scenes from the NGSIM data set, is able to match that much more closely than the Bayesian network approach, which just kind of does the same thing everywhere. So the contribution of this is a new method for factor graph distributions, so distributions over driving scenes, which will extend to situations. Roadways are populated as they are in the real world. We get these distributions over vehicle relations and types. It works with arbitrary roadways, and it extends to incorporate intention and behavior parameters. Still some drawbacks. Everything has a drawback. We do need to specify the factor graph construction rules. So it has to be unambiguous, given a scene of cars, how to build that graph. You need to run it for a burn-in time. There is, to my knowledge, no great way to determine exactly how much that time needs to be. If you go too short, you're biased towards the initial scene configuration. If you go too long, you're wasting compute. And lastly, it requires starting scenes from which to run Metropolis Hastings. And typically, this isn't that huge of a concern because A, you can use scenes you've seen in the world, and B, you can seed it artificially if you're worried about a particular scene distribution or a scene situation, and then run Metropolis Hastings, and it will still shuffle it around and get something seeded by that, but more probabilistically valid, should it not have this. All right. I will now move on to accelerated validation. So this is the problem that we have to cover these billions of miles. And now that we're in simulation, we still don't want to do billions of miles. Even that is expensive. You can imagine, in my case, we have relatively simple 2D cars driving on a roadway. If you're doing this maybe at Bosch, you have LiDAR sensor models, radar models. All of these cars have intricate behaviors. You may have deep neural networks predicting what people will do. So all of these simulations can still be expensive. We want to accelerate the validation and avoid as much work as we can. One way to do that is to only consider a representative set of critical situations. So maybe, as the government, I say, okay, we care about this rear end situation, we care about this quick lane change that was not expected, and we set out this set of critical situations. As a car company, I then test each of them, and I show that my vehicle passes. And that's great, because then you can check them off. Unfortunately, the question remains, how do we get that set? Are we really confident that the set covers the whole space. And beyond that, this will give us severity. So this will say, oh, I had a fatality. But the likelihood here is lost unless it's explicitly included, and it's not clear whether that is. Second approach is to exhaustively enumerate over every possible situation that could be encountered. This is infeasible. And just consider n cars. If they're aggressive or timid, suddenly you have 2 to the n variables, and that's already exponential. So this is going to be really bad. If you consider all of the different configurations of cars, number of cars, behavior parameters, roadways, times of day, weather, road conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So too much going on. A third approach, which has a lot of promise, is adaptive stress testing. And this is being actively pursued by SISL. And the idea here is we want to figure out where our car fails in the most risky fashion. So we're maximizing the likelihood of this severity and the severity itself. And so here you put your car in the simulator, and then you optimize the other participants' behavior such that they act in a likely manner, but also in a manner that causes an accident. So this is very good for finding holes in your system. Not necessarily sure whether this will find all of the failure modes of your system, so you still need something else to cover the large aspect. But this is really good for finding specific holes for your system and for finding holes in your simulator, because the entities will exploit them. All right. The last method, which is fantastic if we could get it to work for cars, is importance sampling. The idea here is we're sampling from the distribution of situations. And if we just sampled from all of them, most of them would be boring. And we want to avoid that. So how about instead of sampling from all of them all the time, we're going to bias that towards the critical ones. So here, the old method is a direct Monte Carlo. I'm just going to sample directly. I would have to sample a whole lot of situations before I get one where something interesting happens. And if I'm trying to estimate this mean, maybe the fatality rate or the collision frequency, I'd have to sample a lot before I can accurately get that result, and this would have high variance. So even if I have one fatality every 100 million miles, I'd have to do billions of miles in order for me to get any sort of confidence. So instead of sampling from the true distribution P, we're going to sample from a biased distribution Q, which covers the whole space, but biases things towards criticality. So here we get these critical situations more often, but we're weighting what we see in order to still back out the correct estimate. So this is a very promising, interesting approach, and it has been applied for specific vehicle situations, so like cut-in on the highway, but it has not yet been used for the full validation for automotive vehicles. My method, similar, a little different. It's actually similar to what Professor Kokendorfer has used for aircraft, where we're going to model distributions over different critical scenario clusters. And we're actually going to do distributions over the situations. And from the situations, we get the scenario rollouts. So we're going to identify critical situations from data, either generated by simulation or from real-world data. We're going to cluster them, and then each cluster represents this kind of critical category. We'll sample from those, and by sampling from those, we avoid much of the boring scenes. And then by using that, we have, in the end, an accelerated validation. How do we get these critical situations first? From then, we get scenarios. So I can run a simulation. I initialize my vehicle from my normal distribution, my benign distribution. And then I run the simulation for a long time until at T-terminal I have a collision. So I get a collision, I call that T-terminal, and by definition, that is high risk. So maybe it's a collision, maybe it's something else that has high severity. Because it's a simulation, I can go back in time because I've recorded it, and at any point back in time, I can rerun simulations to estimate the risk associated with that past scene. I can do that, and then I get a curve that looks something like this. If I go back far enough in time, we get normal, safe driving, just because most of driving is normal and safe. And then at some point, the risk increases until we get to our terminal state. So we're interested in kind of this region here. Something happened that caused us to transition from safe driving to a critical situation. So we want this area here, which is that critical transition. I am defining it using a criticality threshold. Once the risk exceeds the criticality threshold, we are under my definition, in a critical situation. And we're going to cluster these points here. In my experiments, we do get curves that look like this. And so here we have actually very, very low, so very benign risk most of the time. And I've extracted just the tail ends of a few of these that did end up leading to collisions. And we definitely see this transition. I set my criticality threshold at 15%. So now a question is, how does that threshold affect the results? So if I set this too low, I will see more critical situations. And I won't be accelerating validation as much. On the other hand, if I set this up higher, so if I set this up at 99%, every single one of my scenes would have the car just about to crash. And sure, you can see how your car performs in the last second, but you're not testing your system leading up to that event. So your system could be doing things that prevent it from ever getting into that situation in the first place. And so we want it low enough that actions that my vehicle take are mostly in this regime, but also high enough that we do significantly accelerate safety validation. And we'll find that actually the vast majority of the time the cars are safe, so we're down here. And so even having it at 50% saves time. This is good. So now we have those critical transitions. We'd like to cluster them in order to get our different clusters, so maybe our dangerous merge cluster, rear end cluster, etc. This is an interesting problem because we have end cars on a roadway. They're moving over time, so it is a temporal heterogeneous sequence, and there are some methods for clustering those. But on top of that, we also have the additional challenge that we have a varying number of objects, which increases the difficulty. I spent some time looking at grammar-based decision trees for this, but for the purposes of this, I ended up using k-means clustering on critical transition features that I chose. So the previous approaches are definitely worth looking at in the future. Because it's not clear how many clusters there should be, I used the silhouette metric in order to select an appropriate number. All right, so now we've learned these clusters. We have them. We can now sample from them. We need a distribution over not scenes, but situations. So we have scenes with behaviors. Turns out we can use factor graphs. And so before we only had the physical state, but now we can also include these behavior state parameters like timidness, aggressiveness. And we can include them just as we would any of the physical state variables. Still have those lane, neighbor, and following relations. We include an additional factor. This is the critical factor. This will essentially single out the cars that are actually involved in the collision. You don't include this and you learn a distribution, all of the cars will be biased towards criticality, at least a little bit, and the ones that should be very critical will be biased away from it. So we want to include this as well. All right. And so now we have one final barrier, and that is that when I sample my scene, I want this risk. I want 15%. You can imagine that if you have this probability distribution, some vehicles will be very sensitive, or if I increase the speed, it can either very quickly increase the risk or very quickly decrease the risk. So I want to maintain this level of criticality. And I can do this by changing that metropolis criterion that we showed earlier. So instead of doing directly likelihood, we'll modify it so that we only accept transitions if the risk stays within epsilon of the target risk. So in this way, we can maintain that 15%. All right, let's look back at this vehicle. So we have this collision avoidance system that will hit the brakes. I'm doing my testing on that. So we have vehicles driving on a torus, so they wrap around. These vehicles are driving according to the intelligent driver model, which regulates acceleration based on relative speed and headway. And that by itself would be extremely, extremely, extremely safe because this is kind of an ideal model. So to add the driver errability to it, we add this errorable driver model, where each vehicle has an attention state. So the vehicle can be paying attention or not. Most of the time they're paying attention, which are these green dots. And when they are not paying attention, they act as if the vehicle in front of them was doing what it was last doing when they were paying attention. And this errorable model will then mimic some driver flaws that we see in the real world. I then generated 1.33 years of driving. and use this data to then collect my critical clusters. We can see different clusters. This itself is a marvel because it's a GIF embedded in a PDF from LaTeX. So, yeah. The cluster is very, very low probability. This is the probability of that frame of being in that cluster if you pick a random frame from the simulation. And so here we have these two cars, and the rear car becomes inattentive, and then very slowly over time eventually runs into the car in front because it never looks up. We have another cluster, and here the rear car will become, I believe, inattentive. And then because it has a desired speed, it speeds up and runs into the car in front. And the last one, we had this interesting kind of sinusoidal effect where cars kind of brake and then cause the ones behind them. And here he became inattentive, or she, and ran in at the last second. We can then take this, sample from these critical clusters to accelerate safety validation. So here what I've done is I took an automatic emergency braking system from a Volvo. Well, the paper I came claimed it was from a Volvo, so I took that. And I applied it to one car in each scene whenever I sampled the scene. And then I ran validation using that approach. So the black line is running a direct sampling, just running it from boring scenes. And this is a log plot, so it has log scale. What that means, this is if you run for 1 second, this is 10 seconds, this is 100 seconds, this is 1,000 seconds. So it progressively gets exponentially larger. If you do direct sampling, it will take 10 to the 5 approximately seconds before you even get an emergency braking activation. Similarly, you can get 10 to the 5 seconds before you get a collision. Note this number is lower because not all cars have the AEB, and so that is consistent. Whereas with the critical cluster sampling, because we start off with critical situations, we can much more quickly find these critical events, so can much more quickly converge on the appropriate value. So that's validation. We can go one step further and do optimization. And so now I can take that same Volvo emergency braking system, parameterize it, and then I can optimize those parameters to trade off between injury rate and AEB activation rate, however I wish. And here we have the original safety system, and this is the Pareto frontier. Based on optimization, I used Gaussian process optimization with maximum, I think, expected improvement. So we can even accelerate this validation, which would have taken much too long were we just doing direct sampling. And so the contribution here is accelerated validation with these critical situation clusters. We can mine these critical situations from data, and I've showed how to kind of define what one is. We then cluster them, and then we accelerate the validation via risk and force sampling. There are disadvantages, as again, everything has a disadvantage. The biggest disadvantage is this assumes that the safety system doesn't do anything to prevent you from getting into the situation in the first place. So if you try to apply this to a fully autonomous car, it is likely that that car is doing things that can change the distribution over what you'll actually encounter in terms of critical situations. And that can be tackled by other approaches, such as adaptive stress testing. And finally, it's expensive to generate these critical scenarios. So methods are still needed in order to either leverage existing data or to generate these, especially for more complicated systems like fully autonomous cars. All right, so in conclusion, my overall dissertation touches these broad areas. I've specifically focused on scene distributions, which kind of bled over into behavior and environment. And I've touched on accelerated validation. So keep in mind that I did cover behavior and sensor models. This is the full list of my thesis contributions. And I believe this is the end of the main talk. And then I will move into acknowledgements. Okay, so before we do questions, we will cover acknowledgements. All right. I have to start with Bert and Dee McMurtry, who and the SGF Stanford Fellowship team for funding my time here at Stanford. So I had the SGF Fellowship, which made things a whole lot easier. And kind of even further than that, we have Bosch. And I've been using this picture for 4 years. So maybe it's time for an upgrade. Okay. So yeah. So thanks to the Bosch team. Jan, Thomas, Philip. I think Philip's remote. And Jason, Jingru, everyone. So Many thanks for all of your support, including data, drives and cars. I had a professor come once who was asked, like, so here, who here has actually driven an autonomous car? I was like, oh yeah, Bosch did that for me. So yeah, it's really cool. SISL, this is the latest SISL picture. SISL is absolutely amazing. We've grown a lot. Over our time here, we've done a lot of stuff together. So this was actually I think 3 years ago, maybe. We had some inter-lab competition with Frisbee, and this is our original, I guess the original first-year team, and a lot of people actually in this photo I think are here. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, 4 years we do change. That's me over there in the NASA shirt. So yeah, things have changed a little bit. But we're all happy. Well, I think I'm happy. I'm happy. All right. Stanford takes interlab competition very seriously, and so it's really good to have. This is serious. Like, it's really good to have departments that cherish both the research aspect, but also the living aspect, work-life balance. We had a great time. We lost, by the way, so it's but we do have the Dread Cup, so you'll have to challenge us if you want it back. My defense committee is stellar. I can say that every person on the committee means a lot to me. So Professor Pavone, you were the first lab that I actually joined, well, that I checked out, and I really liked working with Ed, and you're the best professor skier that I've ever met, for sure. Maybe the best skier total. That was pretty.
That was before my injury, though.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess so you take that skill and you put it in professorship. So, Professor Ehrman, thank you very much. You helped me with some important sampling questions I definitely had, and you came to my rescue in my for doing calls the second time. So thank you, Professor Alonso, and so your class. So when I came to Stanford, I took Michael's optimization class, which I think used to be yours, and we were talking about optimization techniques, and I think it was MDO. And then you asked, like, so, like, as an example, like, genetic algorithms maybe aren't as efficient, so, like, who here has actually used them? I was like, oh, yeah, me, I did this, like, thing with, like, 50 variables. And you're like, oh, like, how did that work out for you? I'm like, yeah, you know, it did. So, but it was great. Anyway, but you're really in touch, and I have to say, your flight class, aerodynamics, was the first one that really clicked for me. So that was great. And Professor Grady's, most charismatic person I've ever met. Also, the only professor to have schooled me in the classroom and on the racetrack. So, because of you, I've been able to be driven by a car that I programmed myself. So, I mean, it's pretty crazy. So, yeah. Michael, I can't express enough how you've affected me during my time here. Just like the professors produce research, but they also produce people. I think that's perhaps the primary thing that comes out of being a professor. I think we really clicked in a really good way. I mean, sure, textbook and papers and stuff, but I think we see eye to eye. I learned so much. Tixie now, but also, like, yeah. Every time I go into your lab or into your office, if I have a problem, you're just like, expound on it, and 9 times out of 10, you're either say, like, oh, here's this research paper, but also what usually happens is just, like, by talking to you, I just figure out, like, what's wrong, and you ask the right questions. You don't say, like, do this. You never say do this. You always say, like, oh, like, what will be done, or like, you guide what happens, and I think that makes us very, like, free to really A, do what concerns us, and B, to grow as people. So, and I think I've grown a lot under your tutelage. So. And there's more. I think there's more growing to be had. All right. So, friends, I can't. I have lots of pictures. I can only fit a finite number. You know who you are. We did some pretty amazing things. Everyone. My family. I have a fantastic family. Support from everyone. since before 5th grade, pushing me to do so. Like I think I went to space camp. Went to space camp because of my desire to do rocketry. Ended up even being at SpaceX, and then finished that and moved to the next thing. Yeah. So my brother is totally steadfast, keeps pushing me to do more. Keeps asking me when I'm finally going to get the cars to work. So I'm trying. Grandma and Grandpa, your support. Okay, yeah. Support over the years has been absolutely incredible as well. Like I said, even things like Space Camp, Florida, traveling the world. It's been, and I cannot, of course. So mom and dad. I picked 2 pictures, one with each of us, but it could have been one. I think we have the best relationship, and I'm only here because of you two. That's great. So thank you. All right. Those are backup slides. So.
Questions from the audience? So go to the back there.
So for the last thing, like on
important sampling. Yeah.
If you're generating these critical events from some model, how hard is it to get models to do a good job of generating critical events? And the models are trained mostly on data from typical events.
Oh yeah, that's a good. So important sampling. So I didn't technically do important sampling, but you can look at it here. So the lane relation, neighbor, and following factors, those are very close to just like normal ones. So those are like kind of the safe ones. You end up mainly learning is this additional critical factor for your situation that then biases the cars that are actually dangerous. And so you don't have to learn quite as many parameters as you would if you're learning the whole scene from scratch. Right. Hope that answers your question. Specifically for important sampling, it's very difficult because you want a distribution over everything, and then you want to bias everything, like that whole distribution to criticality. And we don't know of a good way to do that, especially when the relative probabilities are so enormous that it's very easy to kind of mess up in a way and then not end up with the correct result. And so that has been done for something specifically like a merging situation on the highway where you control all the parameters and collect a lot of data specifically for that. But for doing general important sampling, that's hard. The other thing is important sampling, there are kind of 2 ways to do it. One is to do it on the initial scene, which is what we're doing here in a way. The other one is to bias the behavior while you're driving. And the problem is if you have a fairly high update rate, so if you're updating at 10 hertz, and if each of those 10 hertz is biased, then very quickly your probabilities like drive to 0. If you have like a 10% chance at every frame that this would happen, then that very quickly after like 10 seconds of driving, that's 100 updates. That's like a probability of 0. So that's a problem. So yeah. Looks up.
So let's say you train these models on drivers from like relatively nice areas, like Palo Alto or like 101 Mountain View or something, and then try to apply it to scenes from places with more aggressive drivers, like San Francisco or India or something like that. How well does it perform in these more challenging situations?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's it's like human driver behavior generalizing to new situations, or critical scenarios generated.
What is human driver?
Human driver behavior. Okay. So so human driver behavior, that's a big deal. It's actually actively being pursued by our lab. So the Gale work that we did was based on NGSIM driving data. So that's just on the highway. It's just based off of these two actual highway situations or roadways. What you can, in order to measure it, you can take data from different locations and actually train on a subset and then generalize to another. It is, so far, it is proving difficult to do that, even more so than just driving. So the field of imitation learning in general, or even reinforcement learning, is looking at even players like if you train your Go player, can still do well at Atari. So that is actively being pursued. I don't claim that I've addressed that. However, in our lab, there's research. I believe this is either active, and if it's not, it's been temporarily postponed and will soon become active. And that is exactly that problem. It is, can we train a good model, maybe on data for Palo Alto? But then how can we leverage what we've already learned and very quickly transfer it to the new approach? So I guess I don't have like a specific answer for you other than that. Yes, it's a problem, and yes, people are investigating.
So if you validated the validation and all of these depending on your real world data, you predicted in some cases how the algorithm can be improved to cut down on accidents. In the real world cases where changes have taken place and cut down on accidents, I think like the aviation industry's had lots of in the last 20 years. For known reasons, this has predicted the same things that they actually did to improve that safety.
It's a very interesting question. I do know that about, based on studies, about 90% of accidents are cited as having been at least partially caused by human error. And so from that, one can intuit that if there is less human error, there will be fewer accidents. The approach here with the braking system very specifically targets the fact that the braking system is never inattentive, whereas the human is. And so in that case, you're kind of specifically patching a problem that is known to exist in the human hardware. Related to your question is the problem of dark matter. And those are, if I put autonomous cars on the road, do I suddenly produce different critical situations? So maybe Tesla, my radar system or my vision system can't handle the white truck with a white background. You can get things like that too. Simulation, we'd hope would catch those things, but then suddenly you have to have very high fidelity simulations, and so that's tricky as well. So in this one-dimensional driving, I wouldn't claim that I discovered new failure modes that weren't in existence before, but that's because of the space that I'm covering. Whereas I would guess, so that this is only what I would guess, I cannot say that this is true, but I would guess the simulation does catch bugs, especially things like adaptive stress testing, which can either catch bugs in your implementation or actually new things you hadn't thought of. So, good question. One more. Okay. Oh, you have to fight over it. No. Okay, well, Ed.
So you mentioned MTMC initialization is sort of a really important part to getting the factor graph stuff to work. I was curious, is the factor graph sort of allowed to change over time, like as things sort of evolve? Like maybe if you want to sample a car changing lanes, then it's no longer in a leader follows relationship with the guys in front of it or behind it. Or did you have to like have a bunch of initializations that capture all of these things, or?
It's a great question. So in the current form, you are constrained to the original graph. You cannot make a transition that changes your graph structure. And so you, based on the rules that you construct a graph with, you can end up with a different structure had you like rechange it. But that is something I've thought about, and I think that is an avenue. So, yeah. I know. Can we do fast?
Yeah, that was a quick answer. So if you want to
okay. All right.
Someone talked about pseudo likelihoods.
Yes.
Can you just elaborate, like, how much better it would be if you actually end up doing high likelihoods, and what are you?
Glad you asked. Boom. Okay.
Oh man.
So okay. So
this is like a setup.
Well, I thought a professor would ask this. Okay. So so I actually looked at the pseudo likelihood is different. So here we have A and then B given A. Here we have A given B and B given A. So those are different. So we have I learned this Gaussian distribution. It turns out with pseudo likelihood, it's harder to capture these correlations. And so if you train to optimize, you can end up with, of course, the actual likelihood and pseudo likelihood are different. So here with this correlation, the pseudo likelihood is much smaller. So the result is different, but that's just the number that you get out. The actual parameters that you learn, here I got 0.96, which is pretty close to 0.9. So you actually you get slightly higher correlation than you would otherwise. And so that's the main difference is your correlation is going to be increased. So I guess one thing to test this with the factor graphs would be to try to do some sort of maximum likelihood. It's no longer concave, but it is close, at least, is what I've heard about it. So, yeah, and it is the industry practice for factor graphs just because it is intractable. So, thank you. All right.
All right.
exam, so we'll take a break for just a few minutes.
Nice job. We'll want to catch copy a little bit, ask a couple of other questions I had.
Yes. I just needed some person in the office to wipe the megaphone.
Yeah, I just needed